And one of the most important things to understand is a hormone called insulin. I mean, you know, you might have heard this word insulin thrown around, particularly if you have somebody in your family or someone that you know who has diabetes. You know, they might be injecting insulin. But insulin is really important to understand. It's important to understand how it works, because when we understand how it works and why we secrete it and all of that, then we can make better decisions as to how much carbohydrate we, or you as an individual, should be having. Okay, so insulin is a hormone that is secreted from our pancreas. And it gets released into our bodies for so many different reasons. When we eat, we secrete insulin. When we're stressed, we secrete insulin. When all sorts of things occur in our lives, insulin comes into play. But by far, the thing that has the most impact on insulin and causes it to be secreted the most is carbohydrate. Absolutely. Okay. Now, it doesn't matter what carbohydrate is to begin with. It could be a can of Coke, it could be a piece of bread, it could be a tub of yogurt, it could be a piece of fruit, whatever it is to begin with. When we eat carbohydrate, we break it down, we chew it up and then we digest it, and when that carbohydrate arrives in our bloodstream, it is always, doesn't matter how it began, it is always going to be glucose. Of course, the quantity and the type is going to impact the amount that arrives and the timing of arrival, but when it arrives, it is always glucose. Now, as soon as glucose arrives in our bloodstream, what our body wants to do is get it out of the bloodstream. We do not want glucose floating around in our blood. Why? Well, number one, it is not useful to us in our blood. We can't do anything with it when it's sitting in our blood. And number two, if it sits in our blood for too long, it actually becomes really dangerous. This is what happens in diabetes. In diabetes, we get increased glucose in our blood. And what happens to diabetics over time? Well, it has all sorts of consequences, long-term complications of diabetes. This is because of extra glucose sitting in the bloodstream. So, as soon as glucose arrives in the bloodstream, our body wants to get it out. How do we get it out and into our cells where we can actually use it? Insulin. Okay? This is where insulin comes into play. So again, I'm going to draw this. Let's get a few colours happening here. All right. So, this is our bloodstream, like that. And this over here is glucose that's arrived in the blood. And over here, we have a cell. So we want the glucose to go from here into here, but it needs a helping hand. And the thing that is going to help it, insulin, needs to be secreted. So here's our pancreas, and it releases insulin. And what does insulin do? Insulin comes along to our cells, and sitting on the edge of our cells are these little things. And these are our receptors. And insulin attaches itself onto these receptors. And as it attaches itself onto those receptors, in the most simplistic terms, opens the gates. So insulin onto the receptors, and that allows the gates to open and glucose to flow in. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so that's what happens when we eat carbohydrate. Is that a problem? Well, if it wasn't a problem, you know what? None of you would be here tonight. They'd all be happy and skinny and, you know, healthy. It's a problem. Why is it a problem? Because those receptors, over time, become less and less sensitive to the action of insulin. And this is where we get this spectrum. Okay? We've got this spectrum over here. On one end of the spectrum, you know that person, we all know one of these types of people, and we hate them. These people, that skinny person who just eats all the carbohydrate in the world and never puts on any weight. Yeah, we know those sorts of people. Oh, that person sits right down over here on this end of the spectrum. This is what we call an insulin-sensitive person. What does that mean? That means that these receptors are super sensitive. So as soon as this person eats carbohydrate, insulin comes out, attaches on, gates open, glucose in, closes up, back to normal. Really quick. And insulin and glucose is out of their system, out of their bloodstream, quick. Okay? Now, down this end. This is the other end of the spectrum, okay? And this is when these receptors are not responding at all. So for these people, they eat carbohydrate, insulin is released, attaches onto the receptors, what happens? Nothing. So they have to secrete more insulin and more and more and more and more, and the insulin levels are going through the roof, and the glucose is building up in their bloodstream, and it's a big mess. And this, I'll speak about in a second, causes lots and lots and lots of issues. The point here is that there's this spectrum. So, you know, where do you sit along this spectrum? There's lots of clues. It's like a puzzle to work out where you might sit. We need to look at a whole lot of things to understand and to work out where we sit on this spectrum. You know, family history, your genetics, what your weight has done over your lifetime, what your health is like, all sorts of things, your blood results, what are your insulin levels, your glucose levels, this thing that I mentioned before, HbA1c, what does your cholesterol look like? All of these factors are going to give you an indication of where you sit along this spectrum. So another word for insulin sensitive is carbohydrate tolerant. So that makes sense, yeah? Because if you're insulin sensitive, you can eat lots of carbohydrates, you don't really have an issue with it because your body works so well at getting rid of them. But if you're down on that side, the insulin-resistant person, another word for insulin resistance is carbohydrate intolerant. You cannot tolerate, your body just doesn't deal with carbohydrates. And people with type 2 diabetes, that is the most insulin resistant that you can be. So if you have type 2 diabetes, you're down that end, even if you are not overweight. So this is, you know, if this is the case, then, you know, can you, if you're insulin sensitive, can you just eat your normal Aussie diet and have 250 grams a day? Well, for me, my beliefs and what I know from research and a whole lot of things is that we can sort of bring this side of the spectrum into this low-carb way of life with this word, health. Because even if you are the most insulin-sensitive person, from a health point of view, I still believe that you should be following a low-carbohydrate diet. You might get away with being more of this style, low-carb, you know, particularly if you look after the quality of your food, and for the rest of your life you could be a really healthy paleo-style eater. Because what we see is we see skinny, healthy kids hit their 20s or hit their 30s or fall pregnant. And then all of a sudden, things change and you're not the skinny kid anymore. And why is that? Probably because your system over time has become more and more insulin resistant. Why? Well, let's take a little bit of a closer look at this.